Hello, everyone, and welcome to Week 6 of Poll 101, American National Government. Now, I have a quick update regarding the course schedule and the order we'll be discussing the topics in the rest of this unit. Over the summer, I built your syllabus with an older edition of the book that the publisher had sent me, and now I'm realizing that the chapter numbers don't quite match up, so I just wanted to clarify that for everyone moving forward. This week, we're going to discuss political parties, which should be Chapter 7 in your book. Next week, we'll discuss the media, which should be Chapter 6. And in Week 8, we'll talk about voting behavior. And Week 9, we'll discuss campaigns and elections. The Week 8 and Week 9 materials are all rooted in Chapter 7 of your book for some strange reason. So just keep that in mind moving forward. Today, we're going to learn all about America's two-party system. We'll discuss why political parties exist, some of the roles and responsibilities of parties, how the parties have evolved and changed over time. And after the video lecture, I've posted your results from the Pew Research Survey that illustrates how the partisan ideology of this class stacks up to the nationally representative sample. So we're going to cover a lot of historical material in this lecture today. Make sure that you have your weekly quiz open while watching the video, or at least take a look at the questions before you begin. This should help you answer those questions, and pay particular attention to the Pew survey results after the lecture, as you'll see some questions pertaining to that content on your weekly homework as well. So with that being said, let's get started. Political parties play a huge role in American politics. One of the most apparent is the role parties play in helping structure elections and getting candidates elected. Furthermore, most Americans identify with one of the two major parties in politics today, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. And much of the policy debate that takes place in government and among voters is shaped by the parties' opposing positions on the proper scope of government in our political, economic, and social lives. The role that parties play in government and the influence they have on elections have changed since political parties first developed shortly after the ratification of the Constitution. Though not defined or even mentioned in the Constitution, a political party can be understood as an organized coalition of interests that seek to influence government and policy by getting members elected to public office and by coordinating the actions of elected officials. Now, the fact that party workers, candidates, and members in society all act somewhat independently highlights the three facets of political parties: the party organization, the party in government, and the party in the electorate. These separate components allow a party to carry out a number of functions, increasing its influence both over government and public policy. The party organization refers to a set of structures at the national, state, and local levels. At all of these levels, paid and volunteer party leaders work to achieve partisan goals. In this organizational system, power is centralized under a national committee. The two largest such organizations are the Democratic National Committee and the Republican National Committee. Each party then has state and local committees that work with the National Committee to carry out the organization's tasks, which include recruiting and nominating candidates, defining the party platform, and getting candidates elected to office. So here we can take a look at the Wisconsin Democrats website. Not surprising, the first thing that comes up is a call to volunteer and soliciting donations for the upcoming election. And if we look at the Wisconsin Republican page, it obviously features the incumbent president front and center and provides a form here for their newsletter. And if we go to the local level, we can check out the La Crosse Democrats page. And there's a few interesting things here, promoting all of the various Democratic candidates in kind of a confusing way at the top of the page and calling your attention to some local upcoming events, which is interesting. And the La Crosse GOP page needs a little bit of work. If you click on these tabs up here at the top, only one candidate is featured on the election tab. There are no calendar events, no blog posts. So this is either not a very active organization locally, or they don't have much of a social media presence. And the fact that each of these political entities at the local and state level have so much autonomy, it can actually be more of a disadvantage than an advantage. No one from the Wisconsin Republicans or the RNC is going to come to La Crosse and threaten their charter because they're not holding enough events or meetings or the website isn't up to date. That's not how the party organization works. But it means that local Republicans have a more ostensibly difficult time getting mobilized or informed about candidates running if the local party organization isn't very involved in the community. This means that party structure overall is extraordinarily decentralized. The decentralized nature of the Democratic and Republican Party organizations limits the power of the National Committee over the state and local committees. The National Committee develops the party's platform in concert with state and local committees, but as a result, the National Committee chair cannot establish the party's agenda unilaterally. Because the chair does not hire or appoint all of the committee members at the national, state, or local levels, they're unable to force the state or local committees to accept policy positions. And, there's some pros and cons here. One, the parties retain a lot of autonomy at all of these different levels. And that's kind of something that I've seen you guys writing about in your, essays and discussion board posts, that across the country, these different regions, states, these different local cities and towns are so diverse. So shouldn't we have a political system that fosters that diversity and allows our political institutions to create rules and promote agendas that are unique to each of those areas? And that's a pro, right, of having very decentralized party organizations. But on the downside, kind of what we just talked about with the example of the La Crosse GOP page, and again, this is really only an inference I'm making based upon their website. I have no idea if they're extraordinarily active in the community or not. But one of the downsides is that inactive organizations essentially face no consequences or incentive to stay active. And in the long run, voters are the ones who get hurt by that. The party organization is further limited in its power over candidates who run under its banner. In the past, parties were responsible for both recruiting candidates and running their campaigns. Today, candidates are able to raise substantial sums of money on their own or use personal funds to hire independent campaign managers, so they don't really rely much on funding from the party in order to run a campaign. And because candidates are able to campaign with little help from the party organization, the party has fewer tools that it can use to ensure that those candidates who run under the party banner adhere to its policy programs. The 2012 Senate race in Missouri is a fantastic example of how powerless the party is over who runs for office. So, in short, the race was shaping up to be quite competitive between Democratic incumbent Senator Claire McCaskill and her Republican challenger, Todd Akin. However, in late August, just a few months before the election, Todd Akin gave an interview with local news in which he was asked to share his view on abortion. Specifically, he was asked whether women who became pregnant due to rape should have access to an abortion, to which Akin responded, quote, "First of all, from what I understand from doctors, that's really rare. If it's a legitimate rape, the female body has ways to try to shut that whole thing down." Which you can imagine caused uproar from both Democrats and Republicans for multiple reasons. So they called upon Akin to exit the race, but he refused. And while the National Party can freeze campaign contributions to candidates, there's really nothing else they can do to stop an unpopular candidate from staying in a race as long as the candidate can afford to do so. So you might not be surprised to learn that by Election Day, Akin walked away with a little more than a third of the popular vote. The party in government refers to members of a party who have been elected to national, state, or local office. Once in office, these elected members often coordinate government action with other members of their party. The party in government seeks to enact the policy agenda defined by the party organization by building coalitions and coordinating the efforts of the legislative and executive branches. For instance, once elected, presidents usually fill top bureaucratic positions, i.e. their cabinet, with members of the same party. And this is the rational thing to do, right? This facilitates executive action on the policy agendas and campaign promises the candidate made leading up to the election. The coordination among elected officials who share the same party identification is particularly clear in Congress. Now, we're going to get into this in far more detail when we get to the Congress chapter, but the party that holds the most seats in either chamber of Congress occupies the most powerful leadership roles, including the Speaker of the House, House Majority Leader, and Senate Majority Leader. And furthermore, the party in power is granted additional privileges when it comes to making committee assignments and selecting committee chairs. So while parties might not have a ton of influence in elections these days, parties reign supreme in institutional positions of power like congressional leadership roles. This is particularly important in light of the fact that the two parties' positions on major policy issues have grown further apart in recent decades. At the same time, members of Congress have become more likely to vote with their fellow partisans. And as you can see here, the two parties have become increasingly polarized since the 1950s, with fewer Republicans and Democrats taking moderate positions. So one really intriguing question political scientists try to answer is whether members of Congress are becoming more polarized because the average voter now holds more ideological extreme views, or whether politicians strategically act more extreme in order to receive greater news coverage, which in turn makes your average voter more ideologically extreme. And this brings us to the final role of the party in the electorate. Now, let's stay on the topic of polarization for a moment. Looking at data from 1994 to 2014, we see that voters in both parties have shifted away significantly from moderate viewpoints. Today, most Democrats participate in politics in a way that is consistently liberal, and most Republicans participate in politics in a way that is consistently conservative. So we see the vanishing of the median voter, those who are moderate and not ideologically extreme. Now, this data is about 6 years old, but the patterns have only strengthened. Voters of both parties are increasingly likely to demonize the other party as the source of contemporary problems and issues. Additionally, we see those who are most ideologically extreme are the most politically active. And when it comes to who donates to political campaigns, we see a similar pattern. So those individuals who are the most extreme have the loudest voices, and they essentially choose who our candidates are because they're the most likely to vote, they're the most likely to contribute to candidates, and they're going to vote for candidates and give money to candidates who are just as ideologically as extreme as they are. So we end up with blocks of voters that are extremely loyal to their party. I mean, just look at the party loyalty from the 2012 election. We can see that 92% of Democrats voted for Obama in 2012. Only 6% of Republicans voted for the Democratic candidate. And the same thing is true for Republicans. 93% of Republicans voted for the Republican presidential candidate in 2012, whereas only 7% of Democrats voted for the Republican candidate. You see quite similar patterns in the 2016 race. Here, independents playing a significant role. 89% of Democrats voting for Hillary Clinton, 88% of Republicans voting for Donald Trump. So the point of the matter is that once an individual identifies with or associates with a party, it's very hard to break that partisan mold. And we see that most partisans are quite loyal consistently to their party, which again is evidence of a polarized electorate. And some argue that the level of polarization in American politics has specifically contributed to the fact that younger Americans are significantly less likely to identify with a political party and instead identify as independents. And all of this has significant implications for how parties target voters. Because fewer Americans identify with a party, the parties now have to work harder to gain the support of citizens at election time. In fact, if we think about the three independent components of political parties, the party organization, the party in government, and the party in the electorate, only one of those appears to play an increasingly powerful role. The power of parties in government shows signs of being on the rise, while the power of parties as organizations and in the electorate appears to be on the decline. So in evaluating the overall strength of parties in the United States, it's important to distinguish between these three facets of a political party. So, does the weakening of parties in terms of party organization and party identification in the electorate have implications for democratic governance? Well, to answer this question, it's important to weigh the advantages and disadvantages of having a strong party presence in our political system. So, one conception of a political world structured by strong political parties is the responsible party government model. This theoretical model highlights how parties can provide a link between voters and elected officials, and it illustrates how the three components of a party, organization, government, and electorate, can play an important role in supporting democratic government. Specifically, the model suggests that parties can increase government accountability if voters are given clear policy choices by the parties and then hold those parties responsible for carrying out the campaign promises at the next election. So this model rests on 5 principles. 1. Parties should present clear and coherent programs to voters. Each party's program should be consistent with its ideology and be distinct from the programs presented by the other parties. 2. The candidates for each party then promise to support the party's programs and carry them out if elected. 3rd, at election time, voters should make their choices based on which party's programs most closely reflect their own values. 4. The winning party should carry out its programs once in office. 5. At the next election, voters should hold the governing party responsible for carrying out its programs by rewarding its members with re-election or punishing them through removal of office. And although the responsible party government model may not be a perfect representation of the contribution that parties make to democracy, it's helpful to understanding American politics because it highlights the importance of voters holding parties accountable, the importance of voters being informed, right? So think about what we learned from the public opinion lecture last week. Could a model like this work, considering what we know about how informed the American electorate is? Nonetheless, it's a matter of debate whether party government is a desirable characteristic of a healthy democratic process. So now I want to spend a little bit of time on the history of political parties in the United States to kind of help us understand how we ended up where we are today. The United States is characterized by a system in which 2 major political parties compete for control of the government. Ever since parties first emerged on the United States political landscape, however, there have been alternatives to the 2 dominant political parties. Third parties, or minor parties, serve an important function of the American political system. They often spotlight issues that are important to members of the public, but unaddressed by the 2 major parties. Alternatively, they may adopt positions on major issues that distinguish them from the 2 major parties. In doing so, they open up a channel for Americans who are disenchanted with the 2 major parties to continue to express themselves through institutional means. Although increasing numbers of Americans refuse to identify with either the Democrat or Republican Party, voters face very few opportunities to support a viable third-party candidate. So, for a number of reasons, the United States possesses and will likely continue to possess a system dominated by 2 parties. One of these reasons involves the electoral system established by the Constitution, which features single-member congressional districts and a plurality election rule. A single-member district system means that only one person can be elected to represent each district. A plurality election rule stipulates that the person winning the most votes in the election, even if not a majority of all votes, wins the office. This system gives all of the responsibilities of representation to a single winner in each district. In other words, the winner takes all. There's no prize for coming in second. In this type of system, according to Duverger's law, there will only be 2 parties that are able to elect a significant number of candidates to political office. This is because parties have to broaden their political platforms to include as many supporters as possible in order to win the most votes in an election. If a party tries to narrowly define its interests, it will be unable to attract enough votes to win elections on a consistent basis. Thus, with both major parties continually competing for moderate voters by presenting broad platforms, third parties stand very little chance of securing enough votes to win a seat in this system. The United States two-party system naturally means that third parties find themselves struggling to gain a foothold in American politics. In many other countries, a legislative district can be represented by multiple individuals from different parties. The number of representatives from each party is determined by the proportion of the vote that party received in the election. In this proportional representation system, smaller parties stand a chance of winning at least a few seats. Furthermore, voters in the system face less risk of losing when casting votes for smaller parties, since there is a possibility of minor parties securing at least some seats in the national legislature. So in the United States, however, the single congressional seat goes to the candidate who got the most votes, and that could be 90% of votes or 30% of votes, depending on how contested the election is. This makes citizens less inclined to waste their votes on a minor party candidate who stands little chance of winning. In turn, candidates who are serious about winning office will rationally choose to run under the banner of one of the two major parties. So there's both advantages and disadvantages to a two-party system. One advantage is that a choice between only two-party platforms makes the political process simpler for voters, especially those who often look for shortcuts when it comes to making electoral decisions. At the same time, in a multi-party system in which voters have more options, they're more likely to find a party that closely reflects their views. A second advantage to a two-party system is that it promotes stability in democratic politics. As the two parties compete for ideological moderate voters, they adjust their platforms to reflect the median of public opinion. However, some argue that this characteristic of a two-party system reduces the difference between the parties. When both sides craft platforms to appeal to the middle of the ideological spectrum, voters can find it difficult to draw distinctions between the candidates. An additional advantage of two-party systems is that they guarantee a clear winner and a definite legislative majority. Voters can more easily identify who is responsible in government and can use electoral politics to hold candidates accountable and to check political power. The disadvantage of such a system is that politics can become increasingly polarized and adversarial as opposing politicians battle each other to win elections. In a multi-party system, parties must build coalitions to secure control of government. This has the benefit of requiring office holders to work together to achieve policy goals, though it tends to dilute accountability for policy outcomes, spreading responsibility across a number of political parties with diverse ideological positions. So although the United States has been characterized by a two-party system for most of its history, the same two parties have not always dominated the political scene. And in the next section, we're going to explore the history of the American party system. During the founding period, two distinct philosophical camps organized around ratification of the Constitution. We've talked about these extensively already, right? The Federalists, whose ranks included Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison, believed that the survival of the nation required a stronger central government. And the Anti-Federalists, including Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, Samuel Adams, feared that a strong central government would threaten individual rights and state sovereignty. Now, while these two groups ardently defended their opposing positions, neither considered itself a political party. In fact, the entire Constitution was written to structure a government independent of political parties. Parties are not mentioned anywhere in the United States Constitution, and the Electoral College does not require political parties to operate. So why does the Constitution create a system of government independent of parties? And why then have we nonetheless had a two-party political system for practically our entire history? Well, first, political parties were left out of the framework of the Constitution because there was widespread disagreement at the founding over the value of parties to democratic life. James Madison agreed that political parties could be divisive, but he believed that the best way to control this dangerous potential of parties was not by discouraging their formation altogether, but to Madison, political parties, a type of faction, as he called it, represented the organized views of a free citizenry. So for Madison, the way to curb the problems caused by political factions was to multiply their number. Both Washington and Madison observed that parties were natural to political life in free societies. Not long after the ratification of the Constitution, two parties had developed to contest the presidential election of 1796 upon Washington's departure. The Federalist Party, an offshoot of the Federalists, which favored a strong central government, right, not surprising, led by Alexander Hamilton, and the Democratic-Republican Party, an offshoot of the Anti-Federalists, which favored strong state governments, was led by Thomas Jefferson. And for a brief period, these two parties were fiercely competitive. Because the Electoral College was designed to work without reference to parties, the Constitution originally stipulated that candidates receiving the most electoral votes would become president, and the runner-up would become the vice president. Consequently, the election of 1796 resulted in a Federalist elected as president, John Adams, and a Democratic Republican elected as vice president, Thomas Jefferson. So this event, in conjunction with the subsequent election of 1800, in which there was a tie in the Electoral College, led to the passage of the 12th Amendment to the United States Constitution. The amendment separated the electoral votes for president and vice president, thus allowing candidates to run together on partisan tickets, and greatly diminished the potential for scenarios like those that occurred in 1796 and 1800. Now, I'll try not to bore you too much with a history lesson, but I think all of this is really critical in helping us understand why our parties are the way they are today. What's really important to remember here is that the tie in the Electoral College in the election of 1800 was not between a Federalist candidate and a Democratic-Republican candidate, but between Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, both of whom were Democratic Republicans. And for a period of time, there was essentially one-party dominance in the United States with the Democratic Republicans. Without an opposition party, the Democratic Republicans turned inward, and internal dissension threatened to fracture the party of the election of 1824. In that year, 4 candidates ran for president as Democratic Republicans: Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, William Crawford, and Henry Clay. With no candidate receiving a majority in the Electoral College vote, the election was thrown to the House of Representatives. Andrew Jackson had won the plurality vote in the Electoral College, but Henry Clay, the Speaker of the House, threw his support behind the second highest vote-getter, John Quincy Adams. And when the House voted in favor of Adams, Jackson turned his attention to the formation of a new party focused on the expansion of political participation, expansion of the nation's territory, and opposition to government economic regulation. In 1828, Jackson was elected president under the banner of a newly formed Democratic Party, the early ancestor of today's Democratic Party. The old Democratic Republicans, who did not favor Jackson or his laissez-faire economic policies, soon formed the Whig Party. Among their ranks were John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, and Daniel Webster. And the Jacksonian Democrats and the Whigs would dominate national electoral politics until the 1850s, when the issue of territorial expansion of slavery created a major fissure among the Whigs that led to the development of the Republican Party in 1854. Since the election of Abraham Lincoln, the first Republican to win the presidency, the two major parties to compete for political power have been the Democrats and the Republicans. Several critical elections over the last 150 years have resulted in electoral realignments that have shifted the balance of power between the two parties. A critical election is one in which groups of voters change their loyalty from one party to another. If this dramatic change in party loyalty persists for several elections, then we refer to that as an electoral realignment. The first critical election to shift power between the Democrats and the Republicans was the election of 1860, which divided the partisan loyalty of northern and southern states, and Republicans successfully elected Abraham Lincoln to presidential office in 1860. Through the Union's victory in the Civil War, the Republican Party enjoyed a considerable amount of electoral success at the presidential level, winning 8 of the 10 elections between 1860 and 1896. And at the congressional level, however, they shared electoral success with the Democrats. The better part of this period, known as Reconstruction, was marked by massive federal intervention in the war-torn South. In reaction to the strong federal presence in the region initiated by the radical Republicans in Congress, Southern voters gravitated towards the Democratic Party, often termed the Solid South. This region's electoral politics would be dominated by the Democratic Party for nearly a century. By the late 1870s, the Reconstruction effort had become unpopular and was being overshadowed by new issues, including government corruption and economic depression. Democrats capitalized on these issues in addition to benefiting from continued Southern resentment of Republican Reconstruction policies. And in 1874, the Democratic Party enjoyed great electoral success, taking control of the House of Representatives and ushering in a new era of competitive electoral politics. The Republicans' party dominance was marked by a second critical election in 1896. In this election, Republican William McKinley defeated Democrat William Jennings Bryan to win the presidency. At the time of the election, the country was deep in economic depression, and Democrat Grover Cleveland occupied the White House. Democratic candidate Bryan ran on the liberal platform that alienated the party's conservatives, who shifted their loyalty to the Republican Party. And for many of these conservatives, the change was permanent. The Republicans won the presidency and the House, but they continued to dominate the political landscape until the 1930s. While electoral politics throughout the previous era had focused on race relations and economic policy, the political agenda at this time focused on federal regulation of monopolies, expansion of suffrage to women, corruption in business and government, labor standards, and immigration. And this period of history is often called the Progressive Era because of the organized efforts of progressives to expand political participation and eliminate corporate and political corruption. Nonetheless, the increasingly conservative Republican Party capitalized on a booming economy and successfully marketed its policies of limited government regulation of business. This period overlapped with a time known as the Golden Age of politics, when political parties enjoyed greater strength than at any other time in American history. What made them so powerful? Well, progressive reformers targeted two tools of political parties that they had seen as facilitating such corruption. The first partisan tool was patronage. And at this time, government jobs were doled out to partisans as a reward for political support. So, with the passage of the Pendleton Act of 1883, patronage was supplanted with merit-based hiring practices to govern the staffing of federal and civil service. But keep in mind, before this time period, it was essentially, hey, do you want a job? Do you want to be able to feed your family? Well, vote this way, and we'll make sure that happens. Right? Extraordinarily corrupt. The second partisan tool was that of the political machine. And in many major American cities at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, parties ran the government. Party bosses organized political support in return for favors, and during this period, waves of immigrants unfamiliar with American electoral politics and political culture were entering the political arena and participating in elections. But political machines would take advantage of the voting power of these immigrant populations by offering services like jobs, food, and housing in exchange for votes. So the Progressive Era was instrumental in bringing about a series of reforms which restored egalitarianism in American politics, but we will discuss that topic in far more detail during the Congress chapter. Now, the stock market crash of 1929 proved to be a major crisis, no doubt. One that the Republican Party and the Hoover administration were ill-equipped to address. And as a result, the Democrats swept control of both the White House and Congress in the election of 1932. In his campaign, Democratic candidate FDR promised to address unemployment and the economic crisis with solutions that appealed to specific groups of voters. This network of voters became known as the New Deal Coalition, and it included unionized workers, upper middle class intellectuals, professionals, and Southern farmers. While the Democrats won handily in 1932, they entered office facing a deepening economic depression characterized by rising unemployment levels, failing banks and businesses, struggling state and local governments, stagnant international trade, failing agricultural prices, and increasing homelessness. In response, President FDR proposed comprehensive legislative reforms aimed at regulating major industry in order to improve working conditions and promote economic recovery. He also proposed a series of public works projects to develop infrastructure and provide jobs to the growing number of unemployed American workers. The leadership of President Roosevelt during the Great Depression earned him the intense loyalty and respect of America's working class. It also led to his election to presidential office for 4 consecutive terms. From the 1960s onward, divisive issues challenged both parties, from both within the parties and between them. The assassination of President John F. Kennedy in 1963 elevated Lyndon Johnson to presidential office. Under his leadership, Congress passed significant civil rights reforms that targeted racial discrimination and lowered barriers to voting for African Americans throughout the South. Predictably, the politics of civil rights drove a wedge between the conservative Democrats of the South and the progressive Democrats of the North. And as the party embraced a platform of extending rights to African Americans and women, it began to lose support in the South to the Republican Party. In 1968, the election embodied this growing intra-party friction and looming partisan realignment. A protracted Vietnam War shook American confidence in President LBJ, and in April 1968, the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. fanned the flames of racial tension, and riots broke out in cities across the country. Republican candidate Richard Nixon ran on the platform of restoring order and pursued a Southern strategy to attract Southern Democrats opposed to the policies of the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. After the assassination of Senator Robert F. Kennedy, Vice President Hubert Humphrey emerged as a Democratic nominee, but he struggled to distance himself from potent anti-war criticisms of the Johnson administration. Humphrey lost the general election to Richard Nixon, who went on to win re-election to a second term in 1972. Now, in the mid-1970s, the nation faced an altogether unprecedented challenge. A bungled burglary of the Democratic campaign headquarters revealed a web of illegal activities coordinated by White House officials and possibly condoned by the president himself. Facing impeachment, Richard Nixon resigned in 1974, and Vice President Gerald Ford assumed the office of the presidency. In the face of the Watergate scandal and a protracted Vietnam War, younger generations grew disaffected with politics and increasingly abandoned the 2 major parties. Not only did voter turnout decline, new voters self-consciously identified themselves as independents. In addition, a partisan realignment of the South from the single-party dominance of Democrats to the single-party dominance of the Republicans created an uncertain political climate throughout the 1970s and 1980s. Over the past 2 decades, the balance of power in both Congress and the White House has swung back and forth between the 2 major parties. From the Democratic presidency of Bill Clinton to the Republican presidency of George W. Bush to the Democratic presidency of Barack Obama to the Republican presidency of Donald Trump, the 2 parties have fought for control of government. It is clear from this pattern that neither party can legitimately claim dominance over the political system in this contemporary period of electoral politics. Within Congress, the parties not only have fought to gain and regain control of government, they have also grown further apart ideologically. In fact, they're more polarized now than at any other time since Reconstruction. And I think what's interesting is when we take into account polarization and generational effects and our evolving societal expectations, you end up with these really complex set of partisan beliefs in the electorate, which is part of the Pew Research survey that I had you take last week. So your survey results are posted on the next page of this module, and I've integrated some questions from that content for you to consider in your weekly homework assignment. Overall, the failure of members of Congress to reach compromise on pressing issues like reconciliation of the national budget and their inability to work together with civility and mutual respect for one another show the implications of polarized partisan politics. This discord reaches into the electorate too. Recent scholarship has found a causal relationship between elite polarization and voter polarization. With more clearly distinguished party positions, voters develop stronger partisan leanings. Now, whether this trend toward greater and greater polarization will continue, or whether the parties will once again seek common ground to create meaningful public policy, still remains to be seen. All right, guys, that's it for this week's lecture. I hope you enjoyed. Stay healthy, stay safe, and as always, thank you for watching.